1 Kings chapter 10. 1 Kings 10 and 11 this evening, 2 Chronicles 8 and 9. We'll finish up the reign of Solomon. Before we get started in Kings and Chronicles, we want to, as we do each week, go through the outline of the book of Kings. We've outlined both 1st and 2nd Kings together as the first 11 chapters of Kings, which is where we'll finish up this evening, is the reign of Solomon. Then in chapters 12 of 1 Kings through 17 of 2 Kings is the divided kingdom. And then in 18 through 25 of 2 Kings is the falls of both Israel and Judah. And so that's our outline of the book of Kings. We could also remember it this way. If you know the 17 periods of Bible history, here's the united kingdom, the divided kingdom, and this is when Judah's left alone. Also in the book of Chronicles, we've outlined it into two major sections. 1 to 9, which we'll finish up this evening, is the reign of Solomon. And 10 through the end of the book, chapter 36, is the kings of Judah during the divided kingdom. And again, as we've said each week, Chronicles we divided as the kings of Judah during the divided kingdom because it focuses on the line of David. And we only talk about Israel itself, the northern kingdom, as it comes in contact with the southern kingdom. Let's go to 1 Kings chapter 10. 1 Kings chapter 10. The first 13 verses are where Solomon is with the queen, as this conversation and the story of Solomon and the queen of Sheba, beginning at verse 1. Now when the queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon concerning the name of the Lord, she came to test him with difficult questions. So she came to Jerusalem with a very large retinue with camels, carrying spices and very much gold and precious stones. When she came to Solomon, she spoke with him about all that was in her heart. Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was hidden from the king which he did not explain to her. When the queen of Sheba perceived all the wisdom of Solomon, the house that he had built, the food of his table, the seating of his servants, the attendance of his waiters and their attire, his cupbearers, and his stairway by which he went up to the house of the Lord, there was no more spirit in her. Then she said to the king, "It was a true report which I heard in my own land about your words and your wisdom. Nevertheless, I did not believe the reports until I came and my eyes had seen it, and behold, the half was not told me. You exceed in wisdom and prosperity the report which I heard." We'll stop there for just a second. We'll pick up in verse 8. So here the queen of Sheba, go back to the beginning, she's decided to come to Solomon, and she's heard about his fame. She's heard about the wisdom of Solomon, heard all these stories about Solomon. So she comes to Solomon to question him with some difficult questions. And what's the reason she comes to question him? She wanted to see if what she heard about him was true. She heard these stories of Solomon. She heard about his great wisdom, and she didn't believe that it could really be true. This can't really be true about his wisdom and all this. So she wants to come and to see him and to question him. But as she comes and she questions him, in verse 3, what does it tell us that Solomon does? He answers all her questions, and nothing was hidden from the king which he did not explain to her. If she asked a question, he gave her an answer. He answered everything that she had asked. And so as she looks around, she perceives his wisdom. She sees all the prosperity. She sees the house that he has built. She sees about all his servants, and the food on his table, and the seating of his servants, and the attendance of his waiters, and their attire, and all this that's mentioned in 4 and 5. It said there was no more spirit in her. That she looks around, this can't really be, everything that's been told to me, as she looks around, this is really true. In fact, she said that that the report was true that she had heard in verse 6. She said in verse 7 she did not believe it until she came and saw it with her old eyes. And behold, half was not told me. You exceed in wisdom and prosperity the report which I heard. You can imagine as she sits here and she listens to this story as she's being told of the great wisdom and prosperity of Solomon and of his kingdom. And she comes to question him thinking, he can't really be this wise, they can't really be this prosperous. And she comes and questions him, and he answers everything. And she sees that he truthfully has wisdom. And she says, this report that I had heard, the report I did not believe, the report that to me, there's no way he could have this much wisdom. Not half of it was told to me. The report I heard did not even compare with how much wisdom he really had. It was as if she'd only heard half the story of the great wisdom of Solomon. I'll pick up at verse 8. How blessed are your men, how blessed are these your servants, who stand before you continually and hear your wisdom. She understood the value of hearing wisdom. She hears him what he's telling, or the servants hear what he's telling others. Could you imagine? Just think about for a second how much you would like to sit at the feet of somebody considered very wise to just hear them speak. She comes all this way just to hear Solomon and ask him questions and see his wisdom. And here are his servants, the people that work for him, and they are here and they get to hear his wisdom all the time as they're working about the palace, as they're working about where he is at. They can hear his wisdom all the time. She says, how blessed are these your servants who stand before you continually and hear your wisdom. There's a value in hearing wisdom. Blessed be the Lord your God, verse 9, who delighted in you to set you on the throne of Israel. Because the Lord loved Israel forever, therefore he made you king to do justice and righteousness. By the way, something interesting to note as you look in this text in verse 9, she says, blessed be the Lord your God, who delighted in you to set you on the throne of Israel, because he loved Israel forever in making Solomon king. When she mentions, blessed be the Lord your God, she's heard from Solomon about the true God, and she heard about, backing up into verse 1, the fame concerning him and the name of the Lord. We know that because if you notice in your text, most translations will have that in all capital letters. There in verse 1 of chapter 10 and in verse 9, she refers to the Lord by the name the Hebrews did. Concerning the name of Yahweh, and then in verse 9, blessed be Yahweh your God, because Yahweh loved Israel forever. She heard from Solomon about the one true God and addressed the Lord by Yahweh, the term that the Hebrews would have used. She learns about the true God from Solomon here and says, blessed is he, blessed is the one that sets you up as king. She learned that while she was there with Solomon too. He's the one that sets you up as king. Blessed is he for setting you up as king, for setting you on the throne. And she said that he has loved Israel. You think about the fact that, and it's been mentioned before as well with the reign of Solomon, that the Lord had loved Israel by making him king because of everything that he had done. Because he does justice and righteousness. You think about the prosperity of Israel at this time. We'll see that here in just a moment. They don't have to worry about all these small little disputes and things going on because of Solomon. The Lord loves them. He set Solomon up to be king over them. And she makes that point here that the Lord had loved Israel. Yes?
I think too, the point that you make here is the Lord loves everybody. But he doesn't like the ways of a lot of people. That's why he's saying, I think that's why he's making this point up.
Good point. So she's mentioning here about the Lord's love for them, and she's mentioning about how blessed are his servants and all that in 9 and 10. She says, she then gives a gift to the king in verse 10. She gave him 120 talents of gold, a very great amount of spices and precious stones. Never again did such abundance of spices come in as that which the queen of Sheba gave to Solomon. Also the ships of Hiram, which brought gold from Ophrah, brought in from Ophrah a very great amount of almug trees and precious stones. And the king made of the almug trees supports for the house of the Lord and for the king's house, also lyres and harps for the singers. Such almug trees have not come in again, nor have they been seen to this day. King Solomon gave to the queen of Sheba all her desire which she requested, besides what he gave her according to his royal bounty. Then she turned and went her own land together with her servants. She brings Solomon these great gifts here as she comes and she hears of Solomon's wisdom. bringing great gifts, things that like the almug trees that had not been seen after that again, that were used in the making of supports for the temple, used for supports for Solomon's house, and were used for the making of some instruments for the singers. And then Solomon gave her gifts as well in 13, and then she went on her way and returned to her own land. But now picking up at verse 14, and going through the end of this chapter, it's talking about Solomon's wealth and Solomon's wisdom. Let's pick up in verse 14. Now the weight of gold which came into Solomon in 1 year was 66 talents of gold. Besides that, from the traders and the wearers of the merchants and all the kings of the Arabs and the governors of the country. King Solomon made 200 large shields of beaten gold, using 600 shekels of gold on each large shield. He made 300 shields of beaten gold, using 3 minas of gold on each shield, and put them in the house of the forest of Lebanon. Moreover, the king made a great throne of ivory and overlaid it with refined gold. There were 6 steps to the throne, and a round top to the throne at its rear and arms on each side of the seat, and 2 lions standing beside the arms. 12 lions were standing there on the 6 steps on the one side on the one side and on the other. Nothing like it was made for any other kingdom. All King Solomon's drinking vessels were of gold, and all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of pure gold. None was of silver, and it was not considered valuable in the days of Solomon. For the king had at sea the ships of Tarshish, with the ships of Hiram. Once every 3 years, the ships of Tarshish could bring gold and silver, ivory, and apes and peacocks. So King Solomon became greater than all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. All the earth was seeking the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom which God had put in his heart. They brought every man his gift, articles of silver and gold, garments, weapons, spices, horses, and mules, so much year by year. Now Solomon gathered chariots and horsemen, and he had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, and he stationed them in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. The king made silver as common as stones in Jerusalem, and he made cedars as plentiful as sycamore trees that are in the lowland. Also, Solomon's import of horses was from Egypt and Cu, and the king's merchants procured them from Cu for a price. A chariot was imported from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150. And by the same means they exported them to all the kings of the Hittites and to the kings of the Arameans. Now, you read through that and you think, what's the purpose of all that? Well, here's the purpose in reading this long list of the great wealth of Solomon. A few things we learn. The first thing we learn is about God keeping his promises. Remember, and we've come back to this several times as we've talked about the wealth of Solomon, but put a marker or keep your finger at 1 Kings 10. We're coming right back, go back to 1 Kings 3 for just a second. Remember, 1 Kings 3, this is the story. Actually, there are 3 stories we're probably very well familiar with in the life of Solomon. One we're going to deal with tonight, that's his fall in chapter 11, where he turns away from the Lord. The story of God coming to him and asking him what he would have him give, and him asking for wisdom. And in the story of him demonstrating his wisdom. 2 of those found in chapter 3. The one about him asking for wisdom, when God comes to him and asks, what would you have me to give to you? Or ask what you wish me to give you in verse 5. And Solomon makes his request here, I want you to give me wisdom. I'm young, I don't have the experience to lead your people like my father did. I need wisdom. God told him there that not only would he give him wisdom, but he'd give him what else? 3 things he mentioned. Great riches. He would give him honor and length of days if he would serve him. So remember, as he promised here, behold, I have done, verse 12 of chapter 3, according to your words, behold, I have given you a wise and discerning heart, so that there has been no one like you before you, nor shall one like you arise after you. I have also given you what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that there will not be any among the kings like you all your days. So you think about the fact that he's asked for riches and honor here. Come over to where we are here. He has great riches. I want you to think about a statement that demonstrates the wealth, a couple of things that demonstrate the great riches and wealth of Solomon in those days. Everything, according to chapter 10, that Solomon had, even the drinking vessels, were of gold. And all the vessels of the house of the forest of Lebanon were of gold, according to verse 21. None was silver because it was not considered valuable in the days of Solomon. The reason is, in verse 27, that silver is as common as what? Stones. You don't find any value in stones. You don't go out and pick up a rock and think, man, this is something of great value. Found a hidden gem here in picking up this rock. But now, if rocks were something that were very rare and you didn't find them, they might be used as something to be traded, something that would be used because they would be of value if it might be of value if it was something rare. Well, in the days of Solomon, the kingdom was so wealthy that to see silver would have been about like seeing a rock. It was just everywhere. And so everything was made out of gold because silver was so common that it wasn't even of any value. But not only was silver not of value because it was common, not only do we see that, why is it and how is it that he has accumulated a lot of this great wealth? All these places around him paying tribute to him. Verse 23 said that he became greater than all the kings of the earth in riches and in wisdom. All the earth was seeking in the presence of Solomon to hear his wisdom which God put in his heart. So here they've heard of the great wisdom of Solomon, and so they come to hear his wisdom. But what did they bring when they came to hear the wisdom? Here's this gift. Here, according to verse 25, they would bring gifts like articles of silver and gold and garments and weapons and spices and horses and mules, so much year by year. As they came to listen and to honor Solomon, they brought these presents with them as they came to hear his great wisdom. Here's his wisdom, here's his wealth, here's his honor. You see, so what we're seeing here is God fulfilling his promises that he has made to Solomon back in chapter 3. Because of his wisdom, people came and honored him and brought gifts which made him and the nation very wealthy. So we're seeing here God fulfilling his promise to Solomon. But now, after we see here in chapter, the story of the Queen of Sheba, which demonstrates that, and as well we see the great wisdom, we come into chapter 11, which is one of the sadder chapters in the life of Solomon. This is where Solomon is going to turn away from God. Yes. And that could be one of the things with Solomon. I think when we look at the story of Solomon here too, as we get in 11, as you mentioned there, with the going back to Egypt, and that's where these horses have been imported from. That I think we view the life of Solomon like, here's Solomon and he's serving God and he's serving God and he's serving God and he's serving God, and now he's not serving God, as if it was just this. Like here he was, this man of great wisdom, and all of a sudden he's just completely turned away from God, as if it happened just like that. But chapter 11 is really a summary of what's taking place here in his latter half, where it was that slow, gradual, this isn't a big deal, where it was likely that slow, here's not a big deal, this isn't a big deal, and before you knew it, it became a very big deal. Among them here in chapter 11 is you slowly drifting away. But the first here, 13 verses, are going to be Solomon turning away from God. Beginning at verse 1, Solomon loved many foreign women, along with the daughters of Pharaoh, Moabite, Ammonite, Edomite, Sidonian, and Hittite women, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, what? Don't marry. You shall not associate with them, nor shall you associate for your good, for they will surely turn your heart away after their gods. Solomon held fast to these in love. By the way, that's recorded for us in Deuteronomy chapter 7 and in verse 3, where God is issuing a warning to them not to intermarry with the people of the land. There's several passages about this warning about associating with the people of the land. Deuteronomy 7:3 says, furthermore, you shall not intermarry with them. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor shall you take their daughters for your sons. Exodus 23, 31 and 33, and 34, 12 through 16 give some warnings about not even associating with them. Not only not to marry, as Deuteronomy 7, don't associate with. Deuteronomy 17, 17 issues another warning there, and it's in Deuteronomy 17, 17 that says, "He shall not multiply wives for himself, or else he will turn his heart will turn away, nor shall he greatly increase silver and gold for himself." Here we have Solomon marrying all these women, and he turns his heart away. Verse 3 says he has 700 wives, princesses, and 300 concubines, and his wives turned his heart away. For Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods, and his heart was not wholly devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been. For Solomon went after the Asheroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and after Milcom, the detestable idol of the Ammonites. Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, and did not follow the Lord fully, as David his father had done. Then Solomon built in a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, on the mountain which is east of Jerusalem, and for Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. Thus also he did for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrifice to their gods. So you can imagine here with Solomon. Now Solomon marries all these foreign women. Reason they're warned here not to intermarry with the people, don't marry these foreign wives, is what are you going to end up mixing in? Idolatry. One of the examples, and we'll be there in just a few weeks, it won't be long before we're there, is the story of Ahab. When we think about Ahab and how terrible things were under him, and he's called worse than all the kings before or after him, and the reason he was so terrible was because he married Jezebel, who introduced Baal worship. So you're already worshiping idols, but now you've introduced Baal worship to the people, and things go a step further. Well, here's Solomon. You can imagine as Solomon marries all these women, it mentioned in verse 1, daughters of Pharaoh and Moabite and Ammonite and Edomite and Sidonian and Hittite. In each of these different areas, they're serving these different gods. Here's who the Sidonians serve, and the Hittites serve, and the Ammonites and the Moabites, and all of these. Here's who they serve. And here Solomon is, who's been serving God. You go back what Solomon's done. I mean, what do we spend most of our time talking about Solomon with? What is he doing? Building a house for God. Remember, he talks about that they're building this house for God, and this house is great because greater is our God than all gods. And now you turn around as he gets older, and he's married all these foreign women, and they're still clinging to who they serve. Clinging to the Asheroths and the Milcoms and the Chemosh, and they're clinging to those. And so Solomon sets up high places for them to worship their gods. And eventually he turns away to serve them too. He built the high place in verse 7 for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab, on the mountain which is east. And thus he did, verse 8, for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrifice to their gods. So God had given them strict warnings. Do not marry with the people of the land. Do not intermarry with those from outside. Solomon not only intermarries with those from outside, Solomon intermarries with somebody from every place outside and brings in all these different idol worships into the land. And it's sad. It's sad. It would be sad in any circumstance to read of somebody who served God and comes to the end, and here he is now turning away. But it's even sadder because you think of the great wisdom of Solomon. You think about how wise Solomon is, and he made some very poor and unwise decisions in who he married, despite all the wisdom that Solomon had. In fact, keep your finger here at 1 Kings chapter 11, but I want you to look at Nehemiah 13 with me for just a second. Nehemiah is one of the return prophets. Nehemiah leads the third and final return. You have 3 returns after the captivity. The first under Zerubbabel, that's recorded in the first part of Ezra. The second under Ezra, that's recorded in the latter half of Ezra. And then the return under Nehemiah, which is to build the wall. And so as they return, and Ezra, this is still in the days of Ezra. Ezra reads the law to them, and it says, here's what you don't need to do. And you don't need to let foreigners in the temple, and you need to tithe, and you need to observe the Sabbath, and so on and so forth. And Israel says, that's exactly what we're going to do. And Nehemiah went back, and when Nehemiah went back, after he had gone back to serve as the cupbearer, he comes back to Jerusalem, And it said, in those days, verse 23 of 13, I also saw that the Jews had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. As for their children, half spoken the language of Ashdod, and none of them was able to speak the language of Judah, but the language of his own people. So I contended with them, and cursed them, and struck some of them, and pulled out their hair, and made them swear by God, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take of their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. You might want to highlight or underline these next couple of verses. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin regarding these? That is, Solomon sinned, Nehemiah warned them, Solomon sinned the same thing that you're doing. Yet among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was loved by his God, and God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign women caused even him to sin. Think about how much time has passed when we roll around to the days of Nehemiah. And the days of Nehemiah roll around, hundreds and hundreds of years have passed from the time of Solomon. We go through the entire divided kingdom, which lasted about 200 or so, a little over 200 years. And then we go through 70 years of captivity, and then I think it's about 70 years again until the last return. From the time of Zerubbabel to Nehemiah, over 70 years has passed as well. We're talking several hundred years have passed. And Nehemiah turns to them there and says, remember Solomon? Remember how great Solomon was? Remember how wise Solomon was? Yet he sinned regarding the same thing you're doing here. Even as time had passed on, Solomon, with all his great wisdom and all his great wealth and all his great power, Nehemiah turns to this story here to talk about the life of Solomon. Because as wise as he was, he made a mistake. He didn't spend time talking about Solomon asking for wisdom when he was young. It was a very wise decision by Solomon. He didn't talk about Solomon talking about dividing the child and so that way they would learn their lesson there. He didn't talk about that. That was very wise of Solomon, but he didn't talk about that. He talked about the worst mistake that Solomon had made. He talked about the most unwise decision that Solomon had made. Because that's what people remembered. Which tells me something. No matter how much good we've done, mistakes can overshadow that. And that's what's happening in the life of Solomon here, is that we oftentimes remember Solomon, not as always for this great wisdom that he had, but as for being a very wise man and making some very poor choices. And we often remember that about Solomon instead of all the other things. And so in verse 9, the Lord was angry with Solomon. After all Solomon's done, the Lord's angry with him because he had turned his heart away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Appeared to him once in chapter 3 and told him in chapter 3, here's what I'm going to give to you. He appeared to him again, we saw last week in chapter 9, just 2 chapters earlier, and said, as long as you follow me, then here's your reward. But if you don't follow me, here's what's going to happen. Well, guess what? Solomon's not following God. And so he's angry at him, and he commanded him concerning this thing, verse 10, that he should not go after other gods, but he did not observe what the Lord had commanded. So the Lord said to Solomon, because you have done this and have not kept my covenant and my statutes which I have commanded to you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you, and I will give it to your servant. Nevertheless, I will not do it in your days for the sake of your father David, but I will tear it out of the hand of your son. However, I will not tear it away all the kingdom, but I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. So he's talking here to Solomon and says, the kingdom's going to divide. Now, on this note, next week, when we get into the story of Rehoboam, we're often very harsh on Rehoboam, and rightfully so for Rehoboam's poor decision that he makes that we'll talk about next week. But it's already promised beforehand that the kingdom was going to be taken away from Rehoboam. It was just a matter of time for Rehoboam to do something before the kingdom was taken away. God's already promised that's going to take place here in chapter 11 because of the sins of Solomon. The kingdom's going to be taken away. Not entirely because of the sake of David. The promise that he made back in 2 Samuel chapter 7 about his sitting on the throne, it's ultimately fulfilled in Christ. But he would still have a descendant sit on the throne. I'm not taking that entirely away from the line of David. But I am taking the majority of it away. And it's going to somebody else. It's going to your servant Solomon because of what you have done. And so in verse 14, God begins raising up adversaries against him. The Lord raised up an adversary to Solomon, Hadad the Edomite, and he was of the royal line in Edom. For it came about when David was in Edom, and Joab the commander of an army had gone up to bury the slain and had struck down every male in Edom. For Joab and all Israel stayed there 6 months until he had cut off every male in Edom. That Hadad fled to Egypt, he and certain Edomites of his father's servants with him, while Hadad was a young boy. They arose from Midian and came to Paran, and they took men with them from Paran and came to Egypt, to Pharaoh king of Egypt, who gave him a house and assigned him food and gave him land. Now Hadad found great favor before Pharaoh, so that he was given in marriage with the sister of his. He gave him in marriage to the sister of his own wife, the sister of Taphanes the queen. The sister of Taphanes bore him Gunabath, whom Taphanes weaned in Pharaoh's house, and Gunabath was in Pharaoh's house among the sons of Pharaoh. When Hadad heard in Egypt that David slept with his fathers and that Joab the commander of the army was dead, Hadad said to Pharaoh, "Send me away that I may go to my own country." Then Pharaoh said to him, But what have you lacked with me, that behold, you are seeking to go to your own country? And he said, Nothing, nevertheless, you must surely let me go. God also raised up another adversary to him, Rezon from the son of Eliada, who had fled from his lord Hadazar, the king of Zobah. He gathered men to himself and became leader of the marauding band after David slew them of Zobah, and they went to Damascus and stayed there and reigned in Damascus. So he was an adversary to Israel all the days of Solomon, along with the evil that Hadad did, and he abhorred Israel and reigned over Aram. So here's Solomon. One of the things to remember too with Solomon is Solomon had peace around him throughout his reign. Remember, David was not to build the house for the Lord because why? Bloodshed. He's a man of war. Solomon was not. However, now Solomon doesn't have peace. Solomon did have peace, but now there's adversaries rising up against Solomon after all this that has taken place with Solomon. And then, verse 26, and this is where the kingdom is going to be 10 tribes are promised to Jeroboam. Then Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, an Ephraimite of Zeradah, Solomon's servant, whose mother's name was Zerah, a widow, also rebelled against the king. Now this was the reason why he rebelled against the king. Solomon built the millow and closed up the breach of the city of his father David. But the man Jeroboam was a valiant warrior, and when Solomon saw that the young man was industrious, he appointed him over all the forced labor of the house of Joseph. It came about at that time, when Jeroboam went out of Jerusalem, that the prophet Ahijah the Shilonite found him on the road. Now Ahijah had clothed himself with a new cloak, and both of them were alone in the field. Then Ahijah took hold of the new cloak which was on him and tore it into 12 pieces. He said to Jeroboam, Take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, Behold, I will tear the kingdom out of the hand of Solomon and give you 10 tribes, but he will have one tribe for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen for all the tribes of Israel. Because they have forsaken me and have worshipped Ashtaroth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Chemosh, the god of Moab, and Milcom, the god of Ammon, and they have not walked in my ways, doing what is right in my sight, and observing my statutes and my ordinances as his father David did. Now, it's been told to Jeroboam that what's going to take place. Kingdom will be divided. Jeroboam will reign over 10 tribes. It's taken away from Solomon, according to verse 33, because he did what? He didn't follow the statutes of God. He didn't follow the statutes or ordinances. He didn't observe them as his father David had done. Instead, what did Solomon do? They worshiped the gods and goddesses of the land, the Asheroth, Chemosh, Milcom. He brings those in. Those from his foreign wives, they bring them in. They have idol worship in the land. He's not serving God as he should. Instead, he's got idol worship in the land. Now, because of that, Jeroboam's told, I'm taking 10 tribes away from him. I'm giving them to you. Look at verse 34. Nevertheless, I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of my servant David, whom I chose, who observed my commandments and my statutes. But I will take the kingdom from his son's hand and give it to you 10 tribes. But to his son I will give one tribe, that my servant David may have a lamp always before me in Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen for myself to put my name. I will take you, and you shall reign over whatever you desire, and you shall be king over Israel. Then it will be that if you listen to all that I command you and walk in my ways and do what is right in my sight by observing my statutes and my commandments, as my servant David did, then I will be with you and build you an enduring house as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. Thus I will afflict the descendants of David for this, but not always. Solomon sought therefore to put Jeroboam to death, but Jeroboam arose and fled to Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt. He was in Egypt until the death of Solomon. So the Lord tells Jeroboam, now I'm giving them to you, but I'm not giving you all of it. Two things. I'm not taking it away from Solomon for the sake of David. Not because of Solomon, but for the sake of David, I'm not taking it away from him. I'm going to leave it, or from Solomon. I'm going to leave it in the hands of Solomon until his death. But then, after his death, I'm going to take it away from his son. That's going to be Rehoboam. I'm going to take it away from Solomon's son and give it to you. But I'm leaving with him one tribe. I'm leaving with him some of the tribe. I'm leaving with him some of the people, so that David will always have a lamp before me in Jerusalem. But the Lord tells Jeroboam here something. And this is interesting. Remember this when we get to Israel real quick. When we get to Israel, it's a lot harder to remember than Judah. So we go through and we talk about the kings of Judah. It's easy to remember because it's the son of David, it's the descendant of David all the way through. It's typically somebody's son, you just follow the line. It's also very helpful when you come to memorize the genealogy of Christ if you memorize the kings, because that's the majority of the genealogies, the kings. You have a few who had a brother sit on the throne. For the most part, it's the same line from the genealogy in the kings. With Israel, it's different because Israel doesn't have a long continuing reign. Jehu had 4 generations sit on the throne. That was as long as any family had sat on the throne. The family of Ahab, his dad Omri, Ahab, and then Ahab had 2 sons sit on the throne. But that's about as long as any family has reigned there because there was constant fighting among them. I say all that to say, we remember Israel for not having any righteous kings. Israel's not going to have any righteous kings. But Jeroboam here, it's not like Jeroboam didn't know. It's not like people like Zimri and Omri who just sought the throne when the ruler was dead. It's not like those that you'll read of as you go throughout the lines of the kings of Israel who killed the king so they could seek the throne. Jeroboam had a prophet of the Lord stand before him and tell him, this is what's going to take place. I'm going to take 10 tribes and give them to you. I'm going to give 2 tribes to Rehoboam. I'm going to be with you. And as long as you follow my commandments and my statutes, I'll establish your kingdom. So Jeroboam is told beforehand. It's not like Jeroboam doesn't understand about God. It's not like Jeroboam, which they all should, being of the descendants of Israel, but it's not like Jeroboam isn't somebody that just come out of the blue and tried to make a decision. It was told to him this is what's going to take place. That's exactly what takes place. So that makes the story of Jeroboam that much sadder when we get to that story next week and what he does in the establishing of idol worship in the land. Because Jeroboam was told, listen, if you serve me, just like Solomon was, if you serve me, the Lord says to him, then I will be with you and I will establish your kingdom. And so he's already been told that here in this text. Then verses 41 through 43, the rest of the acts of Solomon, whatever he did in all his wisdom, are they not written in the books of the acts of Solomon? Thus the time of Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over Israel was 40 years. Remember this. The United Kingdom lasts for, we've talked about this before, the United Kingdom lasts for 120 years, approximately. Technically, the kingdom was divided a short time under David, and it's technically not divided immediately under Rehoboam, but shortly thereafter. But remember, just in round figures, it lasted 120 years. Saul reigned for 40, David reigned for 40, Solomon reigned for 40. It lasted for 120 years. Now, 2 Chronicles, and we'll run through this rather quickly, 8 and 9, so our time is almost up. Parallels with these 2 chapters. Chapter 8, there's some cities that Solomon had either built or some cities that he had captured, recorded for us in 1 to 6. Talks about that at the end of 20 years that Solomon had built the house of the Lord in his own house. He built the city which was Huram and gave it to him and settled the sons of Israel there. Then he went to Hamath Zobah and captured it. He built Tadmor in the wilderness and the storage cities he built in Hamath. He also built Beth Horon and the lower Beth Horon, fortified cities with walls, gates, and bars. So there's a list there of some of the cities that Solomon had built. 7 to 18 is some of his other accomplishments that had taken place. Talks about that the people who were left of the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites that were not of Israel, of these descendants, that he did not make slaves for his work from the sons of Israel. He used those instead from the other nations. It talks about some of his work that takes place there, his offering of burnt offerings in 14 to the Lord on the altar of the Lord that he built before the porch, or in verse 12 rather. Verse 16, thus all the work Solomon carried out from the days of the foundation of the house of the Lord until it was finished. So that's recorded here in chapter 8, some of the work of Solomon. Chapter 9 parallels a lot of what we saw over in chapter 10 of 1 Kings. There's Solomon and the Queen of Sheba in 1 to 12. There's Solomon's wealth and power in 13 to 30. And then it's just recorded in verse 31 about Solomon's death. It's not recorded in as much detail as it is over in Kings. And Chronicles does not record there as much about his downfall as recorded in Kings. Now, we're running through that rather quickly. But let's get to some practical lessons and make some practical application of what we learned from the end of the life of Solomon before our time is up. What are some practical lessons we can see in this text as we go from these 4 chapters that we've seen? Right. There's warnings and then there's consequences. That's a good point. It's not like God didn't warn Solomon. It's not like God hasn't warned us today. Here, if you do this, then here's your reward. If you do not do this, here's your punishment. And it's not like we're not warned today. We are warned, just as Solomon was. And if we don't follow the warning, there is consequences. What else do we say? Right, that's a good point. There's not a time where it's just that you've arrived and enough was done. I mean, think about Paul, who eventually gave his life and talks about how he was, his age, as he talks in books like Philippians and all that. And much time passed, and a few years passed from then until he eventually gives his life. But he never gave up. Which brings to this point, close is not good enough. Just getting close to the end was not good enough for Solomon. Now, I will say this. I do believe that Ecclesiastes was likely written after the events of 1 Kings 11. But that we can't be conclusive about that. I would like to hope that that's the case, because he talks about some lessons he's learned about trying to seek happiness with women and wealth and work and wisdom and all that. And it seems to be written from an older Solomon, whether that's before or after the events recorded of chapter 11. It's hard to be conclusive, but it is written by Solomon from an older point of view, looking back, saying, here's what I've learned in my life as I look back at all the things that I have tried, and here's the conclusion I've come to. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole of man. Do you think, too, that it reminds us that one bad deed can undo all the good we've done? Because I think we sometimes look at good and bad as if it's like a balance scale, and as long as my good outweighs my bad, then I'm okay. But in reality, one bad deed can undo a whole lot of good. We don't talk about Solomon as much for all the good that Solomon did, but we often talk about the mistake he made. One mistake, a big mistake, but a mistake that we record there, we remember it more than the good that he had done. Remember that God keeps His promises. We talked about that time and time again. God says, I'll give you wealth, wisdom, and honor. Here's wealth, wisdom, and honor. God says, I'm going to take the kingdom away from you. He says it again here. He said, if you don't follow me, this is what's going to happen. He then said, it's going to happen because you didn't follow me. When we come into next week, we're going to see here's where it happens. That the kingdom's taken away because he does not follow God. We see that evil deeds will be punished. God punishes those that do evil. And we see that take place in the text here as God is punishing them, and there's adversaries rising up, and there's this between Jeroboam and Solomon going on, is he's appointed Jeroboam over work, but now he's mad at him because he's industrious, and he's heard this prophecy that's made to him, and all this, and it's torturing Solomon. Solomon's eventually going to be punished, and his kingdom's going to be taken out of his family's hands. See the power of influence. All those that Solomon was around, which brings us to the last one, important to choosing a mate wisely in this text because of the power of influence. Solomon was affected by those that he had married, and they brought his heart away from serving God. And that tells us the importance of one using wisdom in the choosing of who they marry because of the power of influence and those we associate with. We'll start next week talking about the divided kingdom.